Good morning, Dr.
Good morning.
Bruce Chalmer. It is so awesome to have an opportunity to sit down with you and have a conversation. It feels like we're across from each other, having a cup of coffee, and I really appreciate this opportunity and you taking the time to be here, and more importantly, your generosity in sharing with me and with our audience a little bit about who you are. Would you mind telling us a little bit about you, where you come from, a little bit about your life thus far, so that we
Sure.
can get to know you a little bit better?
Yeah. Well, I was born in Buffalo, New York, and how old am I now? 74. I just recently turned 74, so I was born in the early 50s, and moved to Vermont, which is where I live now, and I've lived here for over 50 years. And originally moved here because I was hiking on the Long Trail, which is part of the Appalachian Trail. Sort of stumbled into a job as a caretaker that summer. Loved it here. Didn't want to move back, and one thing led to another. I ended up going to the University of Vermont and first got a master's degree in statistics, and that led me, oddly enough, into a PhD in psychology, and not on the clinical side, on the research side, and enjoyed doing that sort of work. It was fun. I was a statistician for a while. Actually wrote a textbook on statistics in the 1980s. You can still get it on Amazon. It's kind of hilarious. I think in the front cover, if they still sell the hard copy version, it has a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, which nobody can use. It's still available. I did that for a while, but then ran into issues in my marriage. I'm in a second marriage now. I've been married for 21 years in the second marriage, but my first marriage, this was a long time ago, ran into some issues in my marriage. And the short story of what happened in my first marriage, though the way I like to tell it is, both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier that way. So, as it turned out, in going through that, when you go through a marital crisis, boy, there's nothing better to force growth on someone if you can if you can manage it than a marital crisis, because it's a super important part of one's life. And I had been married to my first wife. I got married very young, got married at 20. We were, high school sweethearts. And so it was really a huge upheaval. And that's what introduced me to therapy, both individual therapy and some couples therapy. And, I look back on it, and some of the therapy I got was really helpful. Some of the therapy I got, I think, looking back on it, was really bad. I mean, they were doing some stuff that they shouldn't have done, but whatever. But all of it I learned from, and excuse me, through that process, I started feeling like, wow, this feels like a calling. What I'd been doing up until then was stuff I was good at, and stuff I enjoyed well enough. Being a statistician, I ended up for a while teaching courses in data communications. I was doing that for a while, but there was something about getting into the field of therapy that felt more like a calling. And so I got trained in on the clinical side, lots of different modalities, including, by the way, hypnotherapy. That was much later. So I know that's your bailiwick. Um, I got trained in EMDR, which is a technique for helping people recover from trauma. But more and more, as I got my license to practice in what was it, 1994. So it's been a little over 30 years. And the more I got into it, the more I started being just inspired by couples work. And couples work is fascinating because it's not. What is it about couples work? I don't know exactly how to articulate it. There's something that feels so immediate about it. People, and I don't mean to be dismissive in any way of lots of different kinds of individual therapy, but there's a lot of individual therapy that's sort of like navel gazing. It's like, oh, I want to understand myself better. And again, I don't mean to be as dismissive as perhaps that sounds. Um, but there is something about couples work that is so directly about, wow, our lives are very painful. It's super important. Lots of people are depending on it. It's not just the couple. I've always felt that way, by the way. I've always felt in all the work I do, I'm not merely responsible to help the person I'm sitting in the room with. I'm responsible to help the wider systems as well. And so working with a couple really seemed to be very fulfilling in terms of doing that. And I have learned so much from working with the couples I work with. I've learned more from them than from anybody else. And I've learned a lot from teachers and trainings and stuff like that. But especially have learned from the folks I work with. It's, whatever our precious techniques are, whatever our understandings are, whatever our own narratives of how we do this work are, nobody fits them exactly. And I also find that kind of inspiring. It's like, yeah, you actually have to pay attention to the real live people you're working with. They probably won't fit all the categories. And then you work with the actual people. So I don't know if that if
That's
that tells you what,
fascinating. Thank you. Dr. Chalmer, I'm curious, when, if you don't mind, what year was your first separation? When did that separation initiate? When did you start the breakup or the separation of your first marriage?
Well, the starting, what could I date that to? The sort of crises started happening around 1989. We didn't break up until 2003. So it was a long period of time before my ex figured out, oh, the problem here is that she's gay, that she needed to be with a woman. She did not, our generation, it wasn't so easy to figure that out. It wasn't so available to people.
I
And
understand
when
that.
she figured that out, a lot of stuff got clearer, but it was a lot of struggle along the way.
So I'm curious. So you have been practicing couples work since 94, 31 years roughly.
Yeah.
Um, but the initiation of that crisis was 89. So there's about 5 years there in which you were practicing. I mean, the
Before I was
prior to you
practicing.
start practicing,
Yeah.
that you were already in some sort of crisis. Those 5 years, 89 to 94, let's say, what was it like for you as a man, as a person, to function? What were those 5 years like for you?
Yeah, what a great question. I'm immediately remembering what pops in my mind when you say that. I mentioned that one of the things I was doing was teaching courses in data communications. I was sent by a company in Vermont all over the country to go to these companies, a lot of big, telecom companies, and teach courses. And so there I am teaching, and I remember days when I would have to go in and teach and appear not only competent but calm. When I was inside, I was just a mess. And then I would go back to the room, the room they put me up in, and I would cry for a while, and then I would show up the next day and do it again. It was a That itself was an amazing teacher for me, that I had to function. And we had kids too. We had at the time fairly young children, and I had to function as a father, and I had to function on my job. And yet I was going through this massive turmoil that I had never anticipated going through. I'd never had any experience going through. And so it was very difficult. That's one way of saying it. It was difficult, but it was also a great teacher. It's like, okay, I guess I can function through this horrible pain.
Right. Then the second phase, or then another phase begins where you start practicing clinical couples work, and
Mhm.
you don't meet your second wife, or you don't start a relationship, if I do the math correctly, until 2003, more or less, because you mentioned 21 years, so roughly 20, maybe 2005 or so, roughly 2000, yeah, about that. So 2004 maybe. So there's a period there where you are practicing working with couples,
Mhm.
but not yet with your current wife, or at least not
Yes.
cemented yet that relationship. So I assume you're single during that period. What was
I
that like?
was, yeah, it is interesting. Yes, there was certainly a number of years where here I am practicing couples therapy in a marriage that wasn't working well. It's interesting. I said things started to break down around 89 and we didn't split up till 2003. It wasn't uniformly awful that whole time. We almost broke up in the mid 90s, decided not to. We're functioning okay for a while there. And it wasn't until that again, my ex then figured out, oh, she needed to be with a woman, it was sort of this moment, this definitive moment. It's like, oh, that's what's happening here. Okay. And then it was painful, but it was pretty straightforward at that point. I was the one who said, oh my God, we're going to have to divorce, even though it's painful. And she realized that was that. And, we all get along fine now. But that period of time while I was doing couples therapy in a marriage that clearly wasn't very healthy, um, that was also very instructive. And I think I did good work. I think I do better work now just because I'm a lot more experienced. I mean, that's, you know, I don't know. Is it the case? I'm in a what I would now call a very good marriage, um, and I don't know if I am a better couples therapist for the fact that I'm in a very good marriage. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think I'm a better couples therapist for the fact that I've been through struggles and I've come out the other side. That certainly gives me a lot of what it offers is faith. What I can offer people is faith.
So I work with couples as well, and this is a topic I've written a little bit about this, and this is a topic that I struggle with, and I'm curious, what is a good marriage? I ask this honestly. I've been through two divorces myself,
Uh-huh.
and I often find myself struggling with that question. What is a good marriage? Because I find that for us to discuss what a good marriage is or a bad marriage is, we have to have like a standard of comparison. There has to be like an ideal, I believe. So this is good insofar as it approaches that ideal, right? So what is that ideal, I
Yeah.
guess? What are we looking for in marriages?
Well, I'll answer that from two different perspectives. One, I listened to your talk about I forgot exactly what you called it, but noting that unless you know the purpose of your relationship, that it's very difficult to say whether it's working or not working. I really enjoyed that talk. I did a podcast a year or two ago where I claimed to have the answer to all the one skill that solves all relationship problems, which of course is absurd, but nevertheless, yeah, ridiculous. But I said it, which is the ability to be mildly annoyed, which is to say, if you can actually be mildly annoyed rather than freaking out, any relationship is going to go better for the very fact that you recognize there is no relationship that won't be somewhat annoying. Annoyance is part of the deal. So, having said that, what is a good marriage? I don't think the other angle I'm going to answer it from. I don't. That's not for me to say. That's for all of us to say. And I don't think there's a single answer. And it relates a lot to your notion of what's the purpose. There may be multiple purposes. They may be vying for vying for priority in anybody's life. And so I don't think there's a simple way to, for me, certainly not for me to say, what is a good marriage? It's whatever the people in it deem it to be. And when I evaluate the success or lack thereof of couples work, it's a fascinating thing. The concept that people will say, well, what's your success rate? Usually meaning how many people stay together. I don't consider staying together or not staying together to be the indicator of success. It is for some folks. But when you're doing couples therapy, there are three different opinions at least available to how well it's going. Each of the two people and the therapist. My opinion about that, I think, is the least important. Obviously, theirs is the people doing it are the ones who matter in terms of deciding is it working or not. And they may have very different ideas of that. I've worked with couples where one of them has felt, oh my God, this is exactly what we needed. Now I know we need to split up. And the other is feeling like this is a disaster. I was hoping we'd come together and, fix things. And it's not for me to decide which of those is correct. I have sympathy for both of those points of view. So, what constitutes success in the therapy is if the parties involved feel like, okay, we're making decisions that feel right to us. And they, as I say, they may not agree on that. But often the lovely ones, the ones I like, I have a bias. My bias is helping people stay together. I really enjoyed it. I forgot which one of your podcasts I listened to where you were noting, again, I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but you were noting, don't come in and just say, oh, you got the wrong person and throw them away. If you fell in love, if you got together, you've got together for a bunch of reasons. It's good to explore that. One of my little bits of advice I'll often give people is if you're not dealing with stuff that is an absolute obvious deal breaker, and by deal breakers, I don't just mean pain. Deal breakers, I mean things that are there's logically no solution other than splitting up. One person wants to have kids and the other absolutely doesn't, and they can't agree on that, and it's super important to both of them. That's a deal breaker. But if it's not a deal breaker, even if it's painful, don't break up too soon. Too soon meaning you haven't learned what you need to learn from this. You haven't done the growth that is going to benefit you going forward, either in this relationship or in some other one. So that idea that says you may need to stay together long enough to figure out what is it about you? What is it about your expectations? What is it about, your background, whatever it might be, that is getting in the way of your having any kind of good relationship? It's a success if people can come through that and feel like, wow, I've learned what I need to learn. Now we can make a decision and, as humanely as possible, be it stay together. And, the couples that stay together, and I work with a lot of folks who are dealing with infidelity, for example, big betrayals of that sort. The couples that stay together through crises like that only stay together because things are better than they ever were. And they are often grateful for it. They're grateful for the struggle. I've never heard anybody say, hey, thanks for cheating. Haven't heard that one. But I have heard lots of people say, wow, thanks for precipitating this crisis. Apparently we needed it because look how much better off we are now. So when you come through that, that's a success. Or when you come through and say, wow, you know what? We've realized we are two really good people. If they have kids together, we're still going to be cooperative with each other, but we realize we can't be a married couple. That's painful, but that's a success of the sort as well, when they both realize that and can move on.
That's fascinating. Wow, I really like the way you explained this. That's really awesome. Let me ask you a question. I'm really curious about this. And I got to preface the question with a quick little story. Um, I've certified and trained over 3,000 hypnotherapists. And over the years, students would always ask me whether I was affected by the work that we do. In other words, if I was personally affected, almost as in a physical medicine sort of way, whether you would be like infected by your patient's viruses type of thing, right? But in an analogous way. So my clients' problems, do they affect me in some way? So this was always the question. So for all these years, I would often say, no, of course not. At the end of the day, I sort of relax a little, I go home, whatever, take a shower, I don't think about this. I would always say that. And I believe it's true for the most part, except once. And what happened was my second wife had a high school friend. They grew up together, they were coworkers, and that woman referred her boyfriend to see me. So that guy was a very difficult person. They had a really conflictive relationship, and he ended up one evening storming out of the office, refusing to make good on his account. I mean, it was a very messy situation, and I was disturbed because it was a little offensive and unusual for him to function that way. But whatever. A couple of years later, this woman, my ex-wife's friend, comes to see me herself. By now, she was with somebody else. She had a kid, and she came to see me. Turns out that she was extremely violent to the degree that one day she broke her arm, literally going to the hospital, cast X-rays. I'm talking like literally broke her arm, punching her pseudo husband. They were not legally married, but the man
Mhm.
that she was with. She was that violent. Breaking the arm was not a one time thing. She was violent. And she was cheating on him. It turned out she had an affair with somebody else while with this guy. And after she punched him, threw him out of the house, and then complained to me that he didn't even call to find out how she was doing. And I said, but you threw him out. Like, what do you want? Whatever. It was kind of a crazy situation. Then that man came to see me, and he was very apologetic, very passive. What doctor? What's his name? I forgot. Calls the nice guy. He was a nice guy, right? And Robert, what's his name? He wrote the book No More Mr. Nice Guy. So he was a typical nice guy, very apologetic. I don't want to separate. I don't want to break my family, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, the wife had broken her arm, punching him in the face, that kind of thing. But that woman was good friends with my ex-wife. And I will be honest with you, I remember going home many nights during those years, and my ex-wife was physically violent toward me. She also ended up cheating, and she ended up doing better than cheating. She actually accused me of beating her up when in reality she was hitting me. The police would come over, and she would say, and they would find me bleeding all over, taking pictures of me, but not her.
Mhm.
And she would say, no, he hit me. And the cops would say, wait, I think you hit him. My eyeglasses were broken, whatever, that kind of thing. and I never pressed charges or anything, but they never arrested me because they would take whatever. And and I was affected. I don't know how to explain this to you. It was a very difficult period in my life, to work with this woman and then go home and experience something very similar in a very traumatic way. And when I look back, I think that that's when I sort of begun to make up my mind that that woman and I, my ex-wife and I, could not continue being married. It was a very
Mm.
difficult situation. And I still think of that as a way in which I was, quote unquote, contaminated, if you will. I think that my judgment was altered by working with her friend who was doing similar things, that my ex wife was doing.
Yeah, yeah.
What's your perspective? And I'm sorry, it was a lengthy
No, that's fine. Yeah.
introduction to the question, but what's your perspective on this idea that whether or not you're affected or infected, metaphorically speaking, by your
I,
patients and your clients? How do you feel about that?
yeah. Well, I don't know. Am I affected? Absolutely. I think I am. I don't know how it could not be and actually feel present with people. I am genuinely involved. It's interesting, one of the things you talked about, that is a reason why I wouldn't have worked with someone who is a friend of anybody close to me for that reason, precisely because it gets really complicated that way. Having said that, leaving aside all of that, I feel like I learn from everybody I work with, and I genuinely care about everyone. So where the line, and I think I've got better at this over the years. Again, it's a matter of experience for me anyway. I just feel like, yeah, early on it was harder, and it feels like it's not as hard now. I would be, I genuinely care about everybody I work with, and so I'm genuinely involved emotionally in the work that I'm doing. But the one thing I offer as a therapist is that I'm the one in the room who's not freaking out. So when I say freaking out, and that's a fuzzy concept, but it's the reason, as I say, I would be, I just avoid working with anybody where I have any other sort of relationship. If I can avoid it, you can't always avoid it, especially in small towns. And I work in a small state. But if you can avoid it, it's good to do precisely because then, it's not just that I care about the people, it's that I have relationships that are affected by it. And that tends to obscure my ability to sit there and be relatively calm, even dealing with really hard stuff. So, but let me get back to the first part. Am I affected by it? Yes. And, the notion that we're supposed to be, it's sort of the old psychodynamic notion that we're supposed to be a blank screen, and they will project whatever they want to onto us, and we are giving back nothing of who we are as people. I don't work that way. I've never worked that way. It's never made any sense for me to work that way. The notion, some people would say, oh my God, you can't disclose any details about your own life. There are folks who work that way. I get it. I do not work that way. I have never worked that way. I'm always, there's different models of doing this sort of work. And at one time, I was really drawn to a model. It would be more like a clergy person in a community than a therapist per se. The difference being if you go to, I mean, I'm Jewish, so it's like I'm not a rabbi, but I play one on television. You know that expression. It's like I'm not a rabbi. I don't pretend to be a rabbi, but at one point I was living in a very small community and one of the few people who sort of knew how to lead services and stuff. And so I was the pretend rabbi there. And that model, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows who you are. They know who you are. You go to a clergy person for help, and you are personally involved in their community. So it isn't completely divorced from that, but there's also a degree of confidentiality. In the therapy model, usually you go to somebody you have virtually no connection with. And so you don't, the idea that the therapist would actually say, oh, gee, I know some of the folks you would never do that. Now, in the work that I do as a therapist, of course, I don't say, oh, I know some of the folks you know. If that's true too closely, I wouldn't work with them. But I definitely am. I can talk about who I am in the community. I can talk about my own life and marriages to the extent that I think it would be useful for them. So anyway, long answer, but
Yeah,
yes, I definitely affected by the folks I work with, and I learn from them, and I'm very appreciative of the
yeah,
learning that
yeah.
I do from them. It certainly affected how I handle my own life.
Yeah, incidentally, I learned a big lesson in the story that I told you earlier about working with people that I knew. And when I was younger, I think, not I think, I know that I was very arrogant in the sense that I thought I could handle all things at all times.
Of
I felt
course.
invincible, basically. And to be honest, I think that's natural at that age. You know, when you're younger, I think that you feel invincible. I guess that's why
Mhm.
they pick young men to be soldiers, right? Because they do feel invincible.
Yeah.
And
Well, in the
and that's
helping professions, especially. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? You get into it, you think, well, I can save the world.
yeah, exactly.
And turns out we can affect the world. Can't quite save it all by ourselves.
Yeah, so I learned that lesson, but that's a really, really interesting perspective. Um, so, so you find that you get involved. That's a very, very interesting. Do you have ever been told, or has anybody ever mentioned to you that you resemble somewhat a historical figure, any historical figures?
I've been told I look like Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, especially when I was about 40 pounds heavier. I guess I look
Okay.
like Jerry Garcia. Uh, Gee, I don't know. Other than that, not that I
Do,
know
do,
of. Has that happened to you? Have you?
do you have like a little bit of an air of Dr. Freud, would you say, like with that kind of beard, or would you
Maybe,
say that? Or
yeah. I don't. I don't come on very Freudian. So people who know about Freud tend not to say that because I don't work in a way that is it doesn't overlap a lot with how Freud worked. Let's put it that way.
okay.
Yeah.
What about Jung? Do you do you read Jung, or do you like that idea of the unconscious, the shadow, that kind of work, or
Uh,
not?
I do. It's not my go-to, but I'm pretty eclectic in what I've learned from. My general sense. I've been trained in lots of different modalities. My earliest supervision, actually, when I got into the clinical work, was pretty classical psychodynamic, sort of an offshoot of psychoanalysis. And so I learned a lot from that, but realized after a couple of years of that, I wanted to get away from it because I didn't want to think of people the way they seem to be thinking of people. I can tell you a brief anecdote about when I knew I had to move to a different area was when I was in a supervision group with our supervisor, and I had a wonderful supervisor, saying nothing bad about him. But I was in this group of other trainees, where a few of us in the room, and we were talking about our work. And this one guy who was working, one of the other trainees, was presenting a case he had worked with a guy who he had seen, I don't know, 4 or 5 times at that point. And he said the guy came in for his most recent session, and he had said, "Wow, it's amazing how much better I'm doing with my wife, with my work, with my kids." And the trainee, in talking about this, said, "Well, obviously that is a flight to health." And everybody was nodding sagely. And I understand the concept. I know what flight to health is a funny concept. It's like, what do you mean flight to health? Well, in classic Freudian terms, a flight to health means it's a defense mechanism. You don't want to face the things we know you're messed up, and you don't actually want to face that. So you will act better. So pretend you're better, but we know you're not. And little twerp that I was, I said, "Well, wait a minute. How can you tell the difference between a flight to health and somebody actually doing better?" And they looked at me like I was, like I had three heads, because obviously he hasn't been doing the work long enough to have cured his deep neuroses. And I realized, okay, I don't want to think of people that way. That makes no sense to me. Again, I'm not saying the concept of flight to health has no merit. I'm just saying I don't want to start with that assumption. And so I work from a very different model, and I got trained in lots of different other modalities. But I learned a lot from that one, as I've learned a lot from all of them.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept, and I want to run something by you. So I find that if you look at the evolution of science, coming from the natural philosophies, back in the 15th, 16th century, one of the impetus for the development of what we now know as science was the idea that religion or spirituality was hindering humanity's development. And I think that from a technological perspective, we can see that being the case. If you look at the Greeks, some 2,500 years ago with their philosophies and so forth, I think that they were more developed in some ways. I think that humanity went through a slump there during the so called Dark Ages, right? So religion does have something to do with that, or dogmatic religion in a sense, right? And my point is that science comes along to sort of rescue humanity from that darkness of the dark ages. And presumably, we're all about the facts and all about experiments and all about what's provable and that sort of thing. But I've attended my share of scientific conferences. I've published a few papers, and I cannot help but to notice that one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century in terms of science is, of course, the structure of the DNA molecule and all of that stuff. And back in the 1950s, and Watson, who was one of the discoverers, Watson, Crick, all of those guys, they named the idea of how information from the DNA molecule translates into living systems through the RNA, the protein, and all that. They call that the central dogma of molecular biology. So the word that they chose to name the concept, dogma, is very religious.
Yeah.
And when you go to these conferences, and the example that you just mentioned, I find that science nowadays is populated by people who are quite dogmatic.
Yeah.
The way I explain to my students, they're quite religious. In
Yeah.
other words, that cannot be because he hasn't been doing the work long enough. That's like a religious dogma.
Yeah.
In other words,
Exactly. Yeah.
rather than saying, let's do an experiment here, let's see, let's investigate, let's find out. No, we call it impossible, or we call it a flight to health, because our dogma or dogmatic perception of it is that it couldn't be true. So I find that science is quite dogmatic in some ways. Would you agree, or how would you? What's your
I
comment on that?
I wrote about that in one of my books, actually. That and I have a whole section. It's my book that's called "It's Not About Communication: Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong," which is a rather arrogant title, I might say. And I point out in that book, by the way, that everything I know about couples therapy is wrong, also, and it's really related to that very concept. It's not that I don't have good ideas, and you have good ideas, and we all have good ideas. Even when those ideas conflict, they're often interesting. It's when it hardens into ideology or dogma. And often you will find, some of the most fundamentalist folks I have heard from are atheists because they are so, and all I mean by fundamentalism, and I know this word gets used differently in different contexts, but by fundamentalism, I mean the idea that says there is only one truth here, and I know what it is, and I won't listen to anything that contradicts it. And that, of course, is the very opposite of being open to reality, which is to say, wow, sometimes the facts come along and challenge our closely held dogmas. And science, when it's working well, is always recognizing it's always open to the possibility that it's whatever it understands will be disproven. And I think I tell this anecdote in the book. I remember hearing on two separate occasions, separated by seems to me like 20 years or something like that, two completely separate occasions. I remember hearing interviews on public radio with scientists. And I remember in both cases thinking, wow, that's a real scientist. The first time was, and I don't even remember what it was some hypothesis or other that some scientist had made many years before. And the Hubble telescope had been sent up. So we're talking 25, 30 years ago. The Hubble telescope had been sent up, and they had confirmed this particular scientist's hypothesis for many years before. And so they were interviewing that scientist and saying, "Hey, how do you feel that your prediction has been confirmed? I bet you feel good, right?" And the guy said, "Well, actually, it would have been more fun if it had been disproven, because then we would have had to think some more about it." And I remember thinking, "Wow, that's a scientist." Because they're saying, well, we've got an explanation, but we know we never have the final explanation. We're always open to hearing something that maybe will disprove it. Well, 20 some years later, it was the Higgs boson when they came up with the confirmation of the Higgs boson, and they interviewed someone. It wasn't Higgs, but it was somebody who had also been involved in predicting that. And they interviewed, I think it was a woman this time, doesn't matter. Anyway, they interviewed her and asked her the same question. Well, how does it feel to be confirmed? And she said something very similar. She said, well, it would have been more fun if it hadn't been, that we'd have to do more theorizing. That's that kind of openness. I actually have a word for that. I call that faith. oddly enough. And by faith, I mean the opposite of fundamentalism. Faith is when you're actually open to experience, when you recognize you don't have, in religious terms, you don't have a God's eye understanding of the universe. We don't understand all the data. We can't possibly understand it. We're all in the middle of it. So we're open to the reality that we're never going to have a perfect understanding. And when you get something, you get data that seems anomalous, rather than shutting down and saying that can't be true, which is sort of what the church tried to do with Copernicus. No, sorry, that's against our dogma. It can't be true that that the Earth goes around the sun. Rather than that, you're willing to look at stuff and say, "Wow, that's interesting." Einstein. What was it that led Einstein look at the data about the speed of light not changing even if the source was moving and say, I guess we'll have to think that time is relative. Because if you do the math on it, that's what it points to. And everybody else was simply saying, well, that obviously we know what time is. That can't be true. And he was saying, well, I guess we don't know what time is. Isn't that interesting? That kind of openness, I think that's the openness one needs to do as a therapist. You have to be open to recognizing you don't understand it completely and be willing to go there in a spirit of curiosity rather than an ideological spirit, rather than saying, no, that doesn't fit. That doesn't fit the rules about what a good marriage is, for example. That's not what you do. You have to behave this way. That'll be a good marriage. Well, that tends not to work.
I agree. Yeah, that's beautiful, beautifully stated. I want to shift a little bit and ask you this question. You mentioned a moment ago, and that your first wife, eventually came up to. There's a point to this, but let me just articulate the question here. She eventually concluded that she needs to be, and then she needs to, right? So I wanted to bring this concept of needs.
Mm,
I think that nowadays I don't know if this has always been the case or not, but I hear it more often nowadays, people discussing my needs, what I
yes.
need. They come over and they talk about their needs. And I just went to see a movie this weekend. I think it was called Materialistic or something. It's about a dating service, whatever. It's
Oh,
in
I
the
read
theater.
about it. Yeah, I haven't seen the movie
Yeah.
yet.
It was a fun movie. I thought it was really interesting. They in the background, I think they brought up some concepts from Jung and Schopenhauer, whatever. I thought it was an interesting movie, but anyway, it's considered a romantic comedy, whatever. But in that movie, they portray, people looking for spouses or looking for dates, and they would come over with these sheets of paper with all of their needs and their
Yeah.
requirements, like a transaction, right? And there are some gurus on the internet, talking about, the human needs and how you have to have your needs met and so forth, So it's all about me and my needs and you meeting my needs, right?
Hmm.
On the other hand, we hear about this rising global narcissism. We hear, on a separate, different burners on the stove. So there's this whole thing that they're talking about now. It became a buzzword. Everybody's a narcissist. Um, and it's on the rise. However you measure it, it's on the rise. And when you listen to just about anybody, everybody's being labeled a narcissist,
Yep.
whether it's pathologically or not, but everybody's a narcissist. And I'm curious from your perspective, doing couples work and so forth. I've always had this impression that love is mostly about giving and attempting to the best of our ability to fulfill the other person. And presumably, ideally, if we're both interested in fulfilling one another, somehow that should work. But I find that people are more and more interested in what my needs are and what I need from you for me to feel complete and so forth. It it becomes more and more of a transaction. There's no question there. I don't know what my question is. I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, it's a great example of things. One of the things we did a podcast about recently, the dread disease of hardening of the categories, sort of like hardening of the arteries, but hardening of the categories. When the categories get too hard, they lose their meaning. It's the same concept I was talking about earlier about ideas versus ideologies. The notion of needs, I don't think is an empty notion. Do you know what I mean? It's like
Yes.
clearly, if I don't drink water for a long time, I'm going to die. If I don't have any food for a long time, I'm going to die. There's needs are an obvious there's meaning there. I don't think the concept of needs in relationships is completely empty. I do think, much as you're describing, a lot of stuff gets described using that language, and that language has the effect of hardening things into categories as opposed to saying, gee, this seems to be the case, but let's look at it. And so it's funny, I talk about that concept of needs in relationships, but I try not to do it in a way that's black and white. The needs I talk about in relationships, and I mentioned that this is just one of many ways of thinking about it. I think there are needs in relationships. What I call them, I talk about two different sets of needs, basically stability and intimacy. Again, that's just broad ways of describing some things that seem to be really important to people. But, and I use the word needs there carefully because I mean, a need is something that if it isn't sufficiently fulfilled, something doesn't work. That's what that means. And there's all kinds of things that people describe as needs that are actually desires. So, did my ex need to be with a woman or not? I don't know. It sure has worked out better that she is. I can tell you that. You know, I don't know. I don't know if there was some theoretical, of course, there was some theoretical universe where she could have made a different decision about it and we could have figured out something different. But we went the way we went, and it seems to have worked out well for everybody concerned. Not without some pain along the way, but who knows? Sometimes you can't tell what was a need or what wasn't a need until you live with it for a while or until after the fact. So that tendency you're talking about on the internet, oh my God, yes, now everybody's narcissistic. Everybody. The tendency is to find a simple explanation for things that just aren't simple, and that often it's useful to simplify, but it often obscures a lot of stuff that causes a lot of damage as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It
that's how.
does. So do you think there's something different about our historical period today, like what we're living in terms of this idea of narcissism? Is there something different about living today as opposed to living, let's say, a couple hundred years ago, in terms of this narcissism, in terms of this label and this hard
Yeah.
concept that you're describing? Is there some truth to that, or is it just a hardening of the category?
I, you know, I don't know. Seems to me it depends on how you want to look at it, I guess. I don't know that much about, what were things like a couple hundred years ago. I've read what I've read, and like, you have too. My sense is no, we've always had hardened categories. They shift over time. One thing that's different now is that it is so easy because of the internet. It is so easy to find a community of like-minded people who will then echo what you say. It's much easier to do that than it used to be. You can do it almost instantly. Somebody comes up with some idea that they think is, explains everything, and it's, the barrier to to entry to getting it out there is very low now. And so people put the idea out there, and the algorithms are designed to quickly find a community of people who will all be saying, yes, 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 that's exactly it. That explains everything. So maybe there's more of a tendency for that to happen more quickly than it used to. But I think the tendency for human beings, why do we want to find simple explanations? One, one simple explanation for that is we want to reduce anxiety. A simple explanation makes you feel better. Why do people become fundamentalists? Because it answers all their questions. So, it does feel temporarily, at least, comforting to decide you have the answer to everything. And, you have the answer to everything so you can relax. And it works until it doesn't. I remember a guy I worked with many years ago, this as a hypnotherapist, this will be perhaps of interest to you. He was a guy I worked with when I was doing hypnotherapy, actually. He was looking to stop smoking. And he was in his 50s, I think, at the time. And he tried a zillion different things. And we were talking about whatever we were talking about. And oh, by the way, he mentions, there was this period of time when he was roughly 30, in his early 30s, where he hadn't smoked for a couple of years. I said, really? What was that about? He said, well, that was in he dismissively referred to it as his holy roller period. What was that? Well, that was when he and his then wife had found this church, a very fundamentalist Christian church, and the charismatic pastor, and he said it was like that. He just, as soon as he found Jesus in that way, he instantly stopped smoking, had no desire to smoke, didn't smoke for several years. Wow, that's really kind of cool. What happened? Well, couple of years in, he discovered his wife was having an affair with a pastor. And so there went his faith, and he immediately started smoking again. I just found that was fascinating. Of course, my solution, Jewish guy that I am, but my solution is saying, well, gee, have you considered Jesus? In other words, what happened, and he said, well, he couldn't go back to that kind of faith anymore because it had been shattered. He had been so convinced that this was all of truth, and then come to discover, well, it wasn't all of truth, was it? The pastor he had such faith in turned out to be a human being too. And so he just felt like he'd have to be an idiot to go back to anything like that, and he was still stuck smoking.
Yeah. There's a different slice to that pie, I think that's really interesting. So in the Torah, right, what we call the Old Testament,
Hmm.
in the Christian side of things, there's this idea that God continuously speaks to people, telling them, "I'm the only one, only worship me," which is an interesting idea because if I told you that I'm the only one in town, I, I think I think other people hearing that would intuitively understand that there might be others around, but I'm
Uh-huh.
trying to impress upon you that only pay attention to me, let's say, right? So I wouldn't have to say to you, hey, listen, I'm the only one, only talk to me if there's nobody else around. So
Oh, of course.
I find that idea that God would tell people, only worship me. I find that idea to be almost indicative that there are many gods, I would suppose, right? But but the point I'm making is that when things like this happen, when a person puts their faith and they change their lives, because I'm going to this particular church or I'm studying this particular ideology, whatever the case might be, and then something happens and their life slips back in some way analogous to what you're describing there, I find that to be an instance that reminds me of this idea. In other words, we have made someone else the God. In other
Hmm.
words, that pastor perhaps became the God, the guide, the source, and that had to be shattered for the person to seek a higher source, let's put it that way. So, had that not been shattered, this person, I think, might have been stuck in that ideology that this one human being is actually my source. I just find that to be interesting. Everything that we put on an altar eventually breaks down. And I
Oh,
find it to be
absolutely. Yeah.
fascinating.
That reminds me of the Zen koan, when you encounter the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
It's
exactly.
and that's of course, and sure, in the context of the Torah where you have all of these assertions that you shall have no other gods before me, that there's no commandment in the Torah that says thou shalt breathe air. It is not necessary.
Right,
The only
right.
commandments are there for things that people violate. And Bible scholars will talk about the fact that clearly, if you understand how the Bible, the language of the Bible, it is often in a context where there isn't an assertion originally that said that the God of the Hebrews is the only God. It's just saying this is the only God for you. In fact, there are some quite explicit things in various places that say, well, other people have their gods. You're not supposed to follow them. You're supposed to follow me. And then later on, it develops that it turns into sort of a more, radical, the idea of a single God. But, monotheism developed over the years. But yeah, it's what's so interesting about that situation with that guy. And as you say, yeah, anytime you have this understanding that says it all reduces down to a simple set of rules or a simple set of understandings and nothing could possibly challenge it, that simply can't be true. As simple as observing that you have, billions of people in the world, or just consider this country, we are so politically polarized. It cannot be true that everybody on the other side of whatever I believe is either crazy, evil, or stupid. It can't be true because I'm crazy, evil, and stupid too in various ways. It just can't be true that the vast majority of people are crazy, evil, or of any group are crazy, evil, or stupid. We're all capable of being misled. We're all capable of being stupid on occasion, or crazy, or whatever, or evil. But most of us, generally speaking, we're just doing the best we can. And isn't that interesting? We come up with different concepts. And again, this is utterly relevant to couples therapy because the two people coming in often are coming in from that standpoint that the other person must be crazy, evil, or stupid, even though they've loved them at one point. And the therapist's job is to be the one that is noting that, starting off with the assumption that that isn't true. And I will tell people that in the first session. I will often talk about that. I'll talk about that, what I mentioned earlier about, stability and intimacy. It's a way of understanding all of this, and I'll, and I usually point out about 20 minutes in, I'll say, well, now that we're all buddies because I've known you for 20 minutes, you know, I can tell something about both of you that relates to stability, which is, as far as I can tell, neither one of you is batshit crazy. And they will usually smile, and observe, yeah, they didn't think they were crazy, but often they were thinking the other person was crazy. And look, occasionally I don't say that. Very rarely in 30 years of doing this, very rarely I have not had that thought. I thought, oh, I see the problem here. Somebody's having a manic episode, or somebody's having a psychotic break, or something like that. But the vast, vast majority of folks I work with aren't crazy. They're just struggling. And they're not evil, even though they've done things that even they themselves will say, oh, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah, but they're not fundamentally evil. They're doing the best they can to struggle with what they're struggling with. And they're not stupid in the sense of they're not insistently refusing to understand things any more than most of us do when we're confronted with something that challenges something that's really scary.
And
So,
certainly they're not, yeah,
yeah,
and certainly they're not intentionally harming their spouses, right? So
usually not. Yeah,
yeah, I think of evil as like intentionally scheming in my mind, how can I create harm and pain for you? That's the way I more or less understand evil. So I don't think they're doing that either. I agree. They're also struggling with their own, So there's another concept I wanted to get your take on. So Plato talked about soulmates, and nowadays we use that term perhaps in a different way, but we do have this deification of the ideal person, right? In other words, if I could only meet my soulmate,
yeah.
everything should be perfect because that person, by virtue of being my soulmate, should be able to fill all my needs, and I should be continuously in love with that person. In other words, whether we explicitly say those things or not, I think there's a vein in our culture out there that talks about the soulmate as this ideal Cinderella Disney-like relationship, happy thereafter type of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and in some ways, every now and then we do find the person that we think of as our soulmate, whether explicitly or not. And in some ways, tying into our previous topic, that person does become our god or goddess because
Hmm.
I finally found my soulmate. I better take care of this person, right? And that's when things tend to break down. And that's when
Well,
people
because you
tend to
discovered
share.
that person is actually a human being.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, all of this to ask you, what's your take on this concept of soulmates?
Yeah. It's lovely, and there's something to the idea. I've joked with my wife sometimes. We do a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 words. What are the 7 words? Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's the 7 words. We can talk all about that. But we've joked sometimes that no, really, it boils down to 4 words. Find the right person. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are folks who turn out to be the right person or the wrong person. It happens. I mean, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. Having said that, yeah, the problem with the soulmate idea, it's that idea, like you were saying, it's like, oh, when you find your soulmate, they fulfill all your needs, everything is fine, and you never have any issues. And of course, that turns out to be nonsense. There's a guy named Alain de Botton. I don't know if he uses the French pronunciation. He writes
Oh
a
yeah,
book.
yeah. A Swiss philosopher. He lives in London. Yeah.
Yeah,
Alain
and he
Boutin,
wrote
yeah.
a book called Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He's
and
awesome.
didn't read the book, but I read an article that he wrote. It was
Yeah, yeah,
extracted from the
yeah.
book, and it's a beautiful idea and he's not at all cynical about marriage. Quite the contrary. He's just pointing out that whoever you marry, you're getting a particular set of annoyances. And I love that because that's what I talked about earlier about, yeah, the key to all relationship problems is the ability to be mildly annoyed, which is to say, oh, this person whom I love, who I'm deeply connected to, who I've now formed my identity with. I think that's an important concept too. It's not just a contract, it's a covenant. When you marry someone, if it is, it's, yes, there's the contractual aspects that say, well, we're together because we mutually benefit each other, and if we stop mutually benefiting each other, we'll reconsider. But there's also the element that says, I have made this union part of my identity, and so of course you're going to be annoying, and I'm going to be annoying, but we'll figure it out. And then the annoyances just stay sort of funny or minor or whatever. If they rise to the level of, wow, I don't know if I can tolerate living this way, well, then you have a problem. And
Mhm.
sometimes those become deal breakers and sometimes they don't. But that concept that says, we know we're both human beings. I mean, oh my God, the one thing I know about myself and my marriage is that I'm annoying. I think I'm far more annoying than my wife is, and it's good that I think that. By the way, that's a especially men should think that. We should recognize we're far more annoying than women are. That's not always true, of course, but it's a good place to start from because then I can recognize, wow, I'm really appreciative of how gracious she is in dealing with me being annoying. She's very gracious. We
Mhm.
laugh about it. She'll let me know if I'm being annoying, but it's not like she hates me. It's like she's being annoyed by something, and I'll try and not be so annoying, but occasionally I will be annoying. That is the human condition. And when that works well, when you're with someone who you might think of as a soulmate, that doesn't mean you never annoy each other. That means when you handle the annoyances, it doesn't amount to much. That's John Gottman's work will say
Yeah.
similar things in effect. The couples that do well over the long haul, it's not that they don't have problems and annoyances.
Yeah.
It's that they handle them with grace.
Right.
Yeah.
So one observation I made, and I want to run this by you. I want to your perspective is so interesting. I'm like fascinated by your explanation. So I want to run this by you and see what you think of it. So it's always been fascinating to me the point at which a couple makes that call to a therapist, right? What happens? I mean, they've been living together, they're annoyed, as you say, there's a problem, maybe there's a third person, whatever the case might be, but they're sort of getting by. They're busy, they're this, they're that, they fight, they don't talk one night, whatever the case might be, but eventually they make the call. They want to invite some clarity or some judgment, perhaps. They want an arbiter who can tell me
Yeah.
if I'm crazy or she's crazy or whatever the case might be. But at some point, they're ready to make their phone call. And I've always been curious about this, in my own life and also in the life of the people that I have met. What happens at that moment, the day before or the minute before, when you make that call? And what I have found, number one, as a hypnotist, I think that what we say in a session or to one another is very different from what's going on at the level of the subconscious. That I
Sure.
have
Yeah.
verified over 44,000 sessions. But what I find that happens is that in one way or another, we all have this fundamental need to be loved and accepted. So Alan Bottain, he's the founder of the School of Life. One of the things that he says that accounts for this feeling that I love you is the notion that you get me, you understand me. I'm weird. I know I'm weird, but you get me. Therefore, I love you. In other words, this idea that we're in love is rooted in some underlying concepts, such as I know I'm weird, but you get me, you accept me, you can love me. Therefore, I love you. That kind of thing, right? So I think the whole thing begins to break down when people begin to not feel loved anymore.
Hmm.
I think the conflict is rooted in fear. What if
Yep.
I lose my source of being loved or accepted? Or if the only person who gets me no longer wants me? And however else we explain what the conflict is, however else we explain the annoyance, what I have found, particularly doing hypnosis, is that underneath it all is the profound fear of rejection. I just wanted to run that by you and see how you want to grab that and where you
Oh,
want to go with it.
yeah, well, what I immediately think of when you describe it that way, that fits very nicely with that 7 word little formula that I described: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. The be kind part, and I explain this in one of my books, the be kind part is about that sense of kinship, that sense that somebody gets me, which is to say, oh, this is a person who's on my side. This is a person who can accept my annoyances and find them, charming or at least not deal breakers. This is somebody who seems to love me and I can feel loved and and they're loving me for who I am. That sense of kinship. And you can't do that if you're in a panic. That's the second part of it. Be kind and don't panic. But don't panic so that you can be kind, so you can feel that sense of kinship.
Mm,
And indeed, what underlies, I think, a lot of couples' issues who come to me is that sense of panic. I'm using the word panic very broadly. The
Mhm,
fear, that
mhm,
fear of loss. When I talked about stability and intimacy, what stable couples tend to do, they will prize stability. And so they will not bring up scary things. They'll
mhm,
try and deny it to themselves or deny it to each other. And that stuff will sit there and it'll start to undermine their sense that they're person. So the fear will build if they're not able
mhm,
to address it. And so the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate the anxiety, being able to bring up stuff that might be scary to think about or talk about.
mhm.
And so the faith part, when I say be kind, don't panic, and have faith, the faith, and I mentioned this earlier, the faith I'm referring to is not religious faith, certainly not
Right,
fundamentalist faith.
right.
It's the idea that says, wow, there's something right about this whole reality business. I can tolerate the anxiety because I know I'm going to benefit from this, even though it's painful. It's like you were talked about in one of the podcasts, one of your podcasts I listened to, about why do you go to the gym? Why do you go work out? You do it because you realize this pain is meaningful in some sense. It's going to benefit me. Why
Mhm,
would you tolerate the anxiety of intimacy? Because you recognize things will get better from doing that.
mhm.
So that's the faith part that says, this whole life business somehow is livable, even though I don't quite know how. It's a mindset. That's what lets you tolerate the anxiety. But that's what I think of when you talked about that notion that, often fear is underlying the problem. And that moment of how do you decide when to go to therapy and what's happening going to therapy. I have a whole I did one of those funny little whiteboard videos. You've seen
Mhm,
those with
mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
animated figures.
yeah.
I did one on it's aimed at women in heterosexual relationships. How to get your reluctant guy to go to couples therapy with you.
Mm,
And it's all about that recognition that what will help her convince him, and of course I do it in that direction because it's almost always, there are exceptions, but it's almost always the woman wanting to set it up in a heterosexual couple. Not always, but
mhm, mhm.
large majority of the time.
My experience confirms that, yes.
Yeah, and it's because women want to talk about stuff
Yeah.
emotionally, and men, we don't have the language for it. We don't have the skills. We don't develop those skills the way women do usually. So what I say to the women, because women will say, well, he won't go with me. He thinks I'm crazy and I should go, or he doesn't care enough to go with me. And usually it's not that. It's that he's terrified, but he won't tell himself that, even certainly won't tell you that.
Mhm.
And when you recognize not only is he terrified to go, he's got good reason to be terrified. What is he afraid of? He's afraid that, for example, the therapist will side with the woman and say, oh, you're married to a jerk. Why do you want to stay with this guy?
Right, right.
Because I've heard stories that does happen.
Yes.
Or he will worry that even if the therapist isn't like that, she will come to that conclusion. He'll lose her. She'll realize, what have I been putting up with all this time? He's afraid of that. And when she realizes, or he'll just figure maybe it isn't a question of who's going to get blamed, but we'll look at all the people we know who go to couples therapy and they break up because that's
Right,
really common. So
right.
his fears are well founded. And when she realizes that, he actually might feel heard. He actually, oh, you get that. You see why I'm afraid of this. And she's like, yeah, I can see why you are. Unfortunately, I'm so unhappy. I don't know if we're going to be okay if we don't do something. We should try this. And then maybe he's willing to try it. He's willing to say, yeah, it's scary. My fear is well founded, but you know what? We better try this because clearly this isn't working. And I don't want to lose you. It's his fear of losing her. Then he realizes, okay, maybe there's some hope here, and then he's willing to try it. So that phenomenon, and the other thing I'll note about the bit about what happens in that moment, when you first set up the session, there is the phenomenon that I've sometimes, I don't think I made this up, sometimes referred to as zero session therapy, where between the time the couple decides to make the appointment and the time they show up for the appointment, things have gotten amazingly better.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't always happen, but often does, for the very fact that they've decided, okay, we're going to do something about this. So they stop repeating the same struggles they've been doing. They're saying,
Right.
let's wait till we get to therapy. And they discover, oh, actually, we're getting along. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that happens in all domains. I think, people come to see me to stop smoking. They say, wow, but I think I'm okay. I don't need to be here because I haven't even smoked this morning, that type of things.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's the same sort of. So you mentioned that your book. Is it one book? Is it several books? What is the book called?
I have the 3 books out. The most recent one is actually, this is being videoed, I think. Some people are watching this. Some people are just hearing it. It's called Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. So that is my most recent
Mm,
book. The and that's all about, as the name implies, about betrayal. Lots of different couples, not all romantic couples. There's some examples in there of some siblings, adult siblings or business partners, or there's a few different kinds of examples of betrayal in there. Quite a few of them are about betrayals in romantic relationships. And so that I wrote that one. The book before that I mentioned earlier was the one about where he said it's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. And then the first book that I wrote, and it came out February 29th, 2020. What
mm,
timing? Just in time for the pandemic. So
exactly.
we couldn't do any sort of in-person book events. So that's how we ended up doing a podcast, actually. That sort of grew out of
Mm.
that. We wanted to launch the book. We did a Facebook Live. We started a podcast. Anyway, that book is called Reigniting the Spark: Why
Oh,
Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
mm. Are
And
those
I have
books?
a book in the pipeline now that I'm just I don't want to give the title yet because I'm not sure it'll stay that. But the next book I think is going to be an actual workbook to work on your relationship with, around a lot of the ideas that I developed in the other books.
I see. Are your books available on Amazon? Where can I find them?
Anywhere books are sold, Amazon, but also through your local bookstore. They're available in all the various formats. You can get them paperback, of course, Kindle, or electronic, and also audiobooks where I did the narration.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. So you have a website, I suppose. I think of, what is your website address?
Very simple. It is brucechalmer.com. If you spell my name right, you'll get it. BruceChalmer, brucechalmer.com. That has information about my practice, about my books, about our website, about our podcast. Whatever you want to find out about me, that's a good place to start.
And do you do online work
I
or
do.
you
Yeah,
do?
it's all telehealth now.
It's all telehealth. Okay.
Yeah.
So you see couples online, no matter
Yep.
where they are, they can call you up or
Yes.
arrange to see you. And is that information available on your website, how a
It
person
is
can
on
reach
my
out to
website.
you?
Yeah. They go there, they'll find out exactly how to get in touch with me and arrange to do that.
Okay. Are you seeing new clients now?
I am. Yep, I am seeing new clients. No, I don't work as many hours as I used to now that I'm in my 70s, but I still am working and I still do have openings here and there. It's because the way I work with folks, I don't have a set number of sessions or a set frequency. Some people I will see early on, maybe once a week, or occasionally even more than that. Then I'll often see couples every 2, 3, 4 weeks. It just depends on how it works and how many sessions. You never know. Starting out, I'll work with some couples where 2, 3 sessions is plenty, and I've worked with some couples where I'll see them, numbers of times a year for a number of years. So it just varies.
Right. Right. Is there something you would like to tell us that we did not talk about? Is there something that kind of stayed with you that you sort of wanted to say and I never quite gave you a chance to say it? Like, is there like a statement that you want to make or a message you want to spread or a concept you want to get out of your chest or anything
Not
like that?
The only thing that comes to mind we did talk about, which is that 7 words, which is, obviously oversimple, but be kind, don't panic, and have faith, kind of summarizes how I like to think about this work. So that's what I would leave folks with, is that: be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Beautiful, beautiful. Dr. Chalmer, do you think we could count on you to come back? And, there's so many topics I want to explore with you.
Yeah,
Uh, I mean, as we were talking, my mind was racing with there's so many other topics I wanted to branch into. But of course, we have a certain amount of time here this morning. So could we count on you to come back and
I would be happy to
explain
come
some
back.
more? Oh,
Absolutely.
awesome.
Yeah, happy
Awesome.
to.
Absolutely. So the podcast, what is it called again? I just want to make sure that everybody.
Yeah, couples therapy in 7 words.
Couples therapy in 7 words, and I'll be sure to put the links on this episode so that everybody can find you, reach you, listen to you. Amazing wisdom, amazing knowledge, amazing experiences. What a delight speaking with you. I'm so grateful that we connected. I'm so honored that we had this opportunity, and I'm definitely looking forward to talking to you some more and exploring some other topics. There's some alignment in our work. I think I approach it slightly differently, but overall there's some alignment there. and I'm eager to discuss other topics with you and go deeper into some of the topics that we discussed today. So I want to thank you profusely for this and say hello to your wife. You mentioned that she's the co-host of your podcast. That's
Mhm.
wonderful. Congratulations on all of your successes. I have also listened to your podcasts and I find it unbelievably, it's really awesome, really awesome. So you're my hero, definitely.
Well, thank you
Um,
so much. I
give
appreciate
us a word of wisdom here to say goodbye on.
that's be kind, don't panic, and have faith. That's my go-to.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. So you have his website, you have his contact information on the notes below, and we're looking forward to talking to you some more. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk more soon. Thank you.
Thank you.